All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Maureen Conway. I'm Vice President for Policy Programs and Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome you to today's event, Communities That Work Partnership, Talent Development for Good Jobs and Strong Economies. We are extremely grateful at the Aspen Institute to the Commerce Department for their incredible leadership, vision, and support as we have worked with 7 communities that work partnership regions, focusing on developing the skilled workers business need in order to create the good jobs the country needs. I also want to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation and the Joyce Foundation for their support of the Communities That Work Partnership Initiative. We have a packed agenda today, and in the coming hour, we will feature 3 individual speakers. We will have a panel discussion, and then we're going to have some Q&A with you all so that we can engage you in this conversation. You can also join this conversation by tweeting. Our hashtag is Communities That Work, but please do silence your phones. And we have great speakers today. You have materials on them, and I am going to be blessedly brief in my introductions of them because you would much rather hear from them than hear me talk about them. And I'm now going to demonstrate how brief I can be as I ask you to please join me in welcoming to the podium the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute, someone I am lucky to call my boss, Walter Isaacson.
Great, thank you, Maureen. Actually, I'm convinced Maureen is my boss. We were just back there, and she was telling me what I should be doing for the next few weeks. Skilled workforce and good jobs that you can be secure in, good jobs that have benefits, good jobs you can be proud of. That is the most important thing for any country, and especially in America. It's what this country was built on. And unfortunately, as we've seen in the past few years, and particularly erupting in our political system, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of insecurity, and a lot of anger coming from the fact that people are worried about where the future jobs are going to come from. I think that one of the things the Workforce Strategies Initiative has done with this casebook and Communities That Work is look at 7 communities that are making it work, starting with education all the way to making sure that skills are the skills that employers need. And if this is going to be built in the future, it's not just going to be built in academic programs, it's not just going to be built at the federal level, it's going to be built where communities, businesses, community colleges, universities, and labor forces work together to say how we're going to get our community to be a place where there are good jobs at good wages. One person who has truly been focused on this is Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker. Secretary Pritzker came to us a while back and talked to us about trying to help put together this program. But even before then, she's been somebody who both with the Aspen Institute and in her hometown of Chicago has been coming up with creative ways to deal with skills for the workforce. I think the first time I heard the notion of skills to the workforce and that concept was when Penny described it to me well before she was secretary. And I know that that's been something she did in her past. She's made it the theme of her Secretaryship of Commerce, and I suspect she'll make it a theme for the rest of her life. It's a deep pleasure for me, but also a wonderful honor. I always sort of smile when she's in the room to introduce the 38th Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker.
Walter, thank you very much, and always thank you for being here and taking the time to, can you all hear me? Is this on? Yeah. Okay, good. And thank you for your friendship and your partnership in making local, regional, and national workforce development our efforts really come alive. Really appreciate that. You know, it's been 18 months since we started our Communities That Work partnership effort. And for those of you who are here from our communities, we really welcome you and thank you very much for partnering with us. I think we've learned a lot from you over the last 18 months. You know, what's obvious, I think, to all of us is there's a lot of anxiety over the changing nature of work. And this stems from a number of things, that while the economy continues to expand, the gains are not being felt uniformly. In fact, they're being felt unevenly. And while unemployment rate is low, the number of jobs that is open is up, and people don't feel like they're getting paid sufficiently to support their families, and yet they're working very hard, and that's a real problem. You know, underlying, I think, the tension that exists out there is really the confluence of a number of things. What I like to call globalization, or the competition that exists for jobs and for producing things or providing services that comes from global competition, automation, and the fact that more and more machines are able to do things people used to do, and digitization, which has both positives and negatives when it comes to being able to be fluent and able to be facile in taking advantage of access to new markets. These forces are creating extraordinary opportunities, but they're also disrupting our communities and our workers and our businesses, and that's having some who feel that they're being left behind. And so the question facing all of us here today is, you know, as business leaders, as academics, as professionals in either government or NGOs, as policymakers, you know, how do we help people adjust to the world where the very nature of work is changing very rapidly? And I think one thing we've learned from our Communities That Work partnership over the last 18 months is there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. A solution has got to be crafted locally. It's got to be business-led. It needs to be community-driven. It requires that we bring together a variety of assets that we have, but there's a role for the central government, and there's a role for organizations like Aspen, which is to try and figure out what are some of the best practices, what are some of the lessons that we've learned, so that we can replicate those, maybe not in the same industry, but perhaps in different sectors of our economy and different parts of our country. You know, when you step back and ask yourself, as I delineated the problem, another way to think about it is we have somewhere between 7.8 and 9 million people unemployed in the United States, and we have 5.5 million open jobs. And I don't know about you, but I haven't spoken to a CEO who hasn't told me, I can't find the skilled workforce that I need to do the jobs that I have open. And yet, at the same time, when you talk to, let's say, an out-of-work steel worker in Lorain, Ohio, that person is saying, hey, I'm a good employee, I want to be employed. What's the training that I need in order to find a job, preferably not too far from where I live already? And this is the challenge that we face, and certainly each of you in the three communities that are going to be on our panel face. And one thing we know is we have to break down local silos. And I think each of you have done that in different sectors, and you're going to share with us, you know, your specific examples. You know, what I've learned personally in visiting, you know, a number, whether it's in Houston or in Dalton, Georgia, or a number of the communities that I've visited, is that we have to ask our businesses to lead more, but we also have to ask our educational institutions to come together with business. We have to include the social service organizations, and we need local government to play a role, plus others. And each of you have demonstrated that in one form or fashion. And the solutions differ sector by sector, and that makes this a complex problem to come up with some one-size-fits-all solution, which won't work. And so that's why I'm so excited that we have representatives from Houston and from Phoenix and from Prince George's County to talk to us. I had the pleasure of going to Houston, and I'll just talk about that example for a minute. You know, their economy's been hit hard by oil prices, and that led to a number of job losses. But the regional leaders were really observant that the petrochemical industry was really rising, and there was a shortage of workers both in the petrochemical industry and as well as in construction. And I had the opportunity to sit down with industry leaders, the educational institutions, starting with K-12, community college, all the way through the universities, community leaders, social service organizations, and they shared how they came together to really come up with a comprehensive approach to this challenge and how did they meet the needs in the petrochemical and construction industry. It was really impressive, and I will tell you, I have talked about this around the United States, about what I learned about, frankly, this need to come together in order to solve these challenges. You know, Houston's approach of tackling the workforce challenge was effective because it was designed for their community. It wasn't designed for a different community. It was designed for their challenges and their community, and that's another major takeaway. But there are lessons that can be executed locally that we can learn and apply nationally, and that's part of what we're trying to do with our communities that work partnership, is to learn from each other and to figure out what are the best practices that can be shared. And so I just want to thank everyone here for your commitment. For those of you who are here to listen and learn, thank you for your interest. For those of you who participated in our partnership over the last 18 months, thank you very much. And for those of our peers at both EDA and at the Aspen Institute, I really appreciate the work that you've done to kind of glean and garner the lessons learned that we can share with others. And with that, I will turn this back over to you, Maureen, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, so much. You can see why we've been so appreciative of the Commerce Department's leadership in this work and the important role that they've played. And it's now my pleasure to also welcome Joe Mckinney, Executive Director of the National Association of Development Organizations. Joe has long and great experience in economic development, and he's going to share with us some of his perspective about how the lessons of the Communities that Work Partnership hopefully can be useful to other communities. So thank you, Joe.
So for those in the room that are old enough to remember Sesame Street, the word of the day is brief. And so I am charged with being brief in some remarks. And a lot of what I say is going to echo the words that the Secretary Pritzker offered. I wish I had a bell to ding every word that I said that she said, because I've had the honor to work with Secretary Pritzker and Assistant Secretary Jay Williams for the last several years on a number of initiatives, and this is a very important one. And I can tell you, we work with over 500 regional development organizations across the country. And I think for those that have worked with EDA in the past, I think you would agree that EDA is the only, or one of the only, but I say the only federal agency that's tied their success, their missions tied directly to job creation, job retention, and that's important to local communities, to regional communities across the nation. That's not a criticism of other federal agencies. That is just more of a compliment to the Department of Commerce and to EDA on their commitment to, as Secretary Pritzker said, community-based solutions, regional cooperation, which is important, which, as you know, kind of breeds efficiencies when you have challenging budgets on the federal level, local level, everyone's looking for ways to be efficient, and I think the Economic Development Administration is a perfect example of a federal agency whose focus is on job creation, job retention, and efficiencies. The other thing that was echoed in Secretary Pritzker's comments was the focus on regionalism. And a lot of times when you're looking at solutions on a local level, it's easy to look at the lines that between cities, counties, and so forth. And really EDA kind of also has a focus on those blurred lines of we're looking at a regional economy. Economies aren't based on city limit lines or county lines, and the solutions that they come up with, that they help local communities come up with, such as we'll hear today, really focus on that regional nature, whether it's in larger cities, whether it's in smaller communities. EDA is really focusing on that regionalism that's really important. The other thing, too, that was mentioned was the fact that EDA, and you'll see in this instance as well, they don't just work with one group or one community. They work with local governments, they work with local officials, they work with universities, they work with the private sector, they work with NGOs, because they know that cooperation, that's the only way and the only key to success is you have to have all those people in the room and all those players in the room to have success. I had the opportunity right before the meeting to be on a conversation between Walter and the secretary, and it was amazing how many times that she brought up or said the word local or said mayor or said county. And again, in my work, I don't always hear that with federal agencies. And I think that when you look at EDA and you look at this success and this project, I think, again, the key is the fact that this is an agency, this is a department that is community-based, community-focused, looking for those solutions. And just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to share some comments on EDA, to pledge our support to this initiative. And I'm excited, like you are, to hear from the panelists today on some of the successes they found on a local and regional level. So thank you again.
Okay, so now I get to welcome some friends up here, so don't be shy. Come on up. And I'm going to stand out of the way so I don't get in the way, but I am very happy to welcome to the stage to talk with me to my left, Jay Williams, U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Economic Development. Next to Jay is Adam Ortiz, Director, Prince George's County Department of the Environment. And next to Adam is Elizabeth Callahan. We'll call you Liz, right? Workforce Development Manager, Buffalo Niagara Partnership. And next to Liz is Peter Beard, Senior Vice President for Regional Workforce Development, Greater Houston Partnership. So thank you all for being here and being in conversation with us all today. And actually, though, before we dive into this discussion, I do want to just take a minute to point out a couple of things. One, hopefully you've noticed that you have a playbook on your chair, and we hope that you all will appreciate that. And there's also a flyer with that playbook that highlights the 7 regional partnership briefs that we developed, and those are available on our website. And we encourage you to take a look at all of these materials. And because we're not going to be able to go into detail of everything that's there, but hopefully this will give you a lot of information about what we've been working on in the Communities That Work Partnership. I also particularly want to thank 2 of our lead researchers and my co-authors on the Communities That Work Partnership Playbook, Amy Blair and Stephen Michon from FutureWorks. FutureWorks has been our partner in this work, and really been great to work with them. And I also just want to acknowledge there's been a really substantial team of staff and colleagues that have done research, that have worked on the implementation of the Communities that Work Partnership, provided technical assistance, helped with peer learning meetings, and so on. And we've listed them all in the Communities that Work Partnership acknowledgements, and I hope you take a look at it. We don't have time to name them all today, but it really has been an incredible team effort, and I'm so appreciative of the team that I've had the pleasure of working with on this initiative. And now we're going to have a little taste of some of the things that we've been working on. But first, Jay, I want to start with you in thinking about sort of some of the themes that the Secretary laid out, and building on that, and thinking about sort of this theme of local and the work that we've been doing with this initiative. Can you just maybe flesh out a little bit for everybody what were the Economic Development Administration's goals for the Communities that Work Partnership, and what you see as sort of how these tools can be used by folks?
Sure. Well, good afternoon, Maureen. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be here. I certainly enjoyed the setting of the stage by Walter Isaacson and Secretary Pritzker, and also to be on the panel with the fellow panelists. I've had an opportunity to travel to a number of the Communities at Work Partnership communities, and specifically have had a chance to be on the ground in Houston and Peter, and talk about to you and your colleagues in the Buffalo and Niagara region. And I live next door to Prince George's County, so really to see firsthand how important this is and how it's being led by stakeholders who are locally rooted. We live in a time of unprecedented opportunity for citizens to participate fully in this globalized economy. Our economy is characterized by innovation and research and development, value-added production, exports, and emerging sectors such as advanced manufacturing. And it has been cited time and time again that the availability of a highly skilled, highly trained workforce, a workforce that has critical thinking skills, is often the #1 issue cited when companies and employers are looking to make significant investments. You know, the days, I grew up in a town of Youngstown, Ohio, and 50 years ago, all you needed in a place like Youngstown, Ohio was a strong work ethic and a strong back. And you could go and be employed for, you know, a lifetime, an entire career, send your kids to school, have money for a vacation, and live a good middle-class lifestyle. Those days are long gone. You know, having a strong work ethic is critically important, but employers today want critical thinkers. They want individuals who have transferable skills that are relevant to what we are facing in today's globalized economy. So one of the goals was to have a process that would identify, elevate, and bring to scale initiatives that worked, because this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So often we are quick to see something that works and say, okay, let's just replicate that many times over in communities across the country. And that isn't what works. What is important and working in Houston may not be directly applicable in Buffalo, Niagara, or in Prince George's County. The principles of having a skilled workforce are the same. Those are universal, but how you go about doing that in a sustainable, scalable model is very different, and it depends on a whole host of factors that are in each of the communities. So we were very pleased to be able to partner with Aspen to identify a number of communities, diverse communities across the country that were engaging in some effective practices that can be brought to scale, that could be replicated, but that also could provide a template to other communities across the country to begin to understand how to build a sustainable ecosystem of workforce development, workforce and skills development. These aren't one-off approaches. I mean, it is great to have individual programs and initiatives, but at the end of the day, it's about creating an ecosystem. So that was one of the driving goals of this initiative, was to identify those resources, those players, those collaboration that would allow sustainable, replicable initiatives in communities across the country, and really identify the fact that these aren't things that are led from Washington, D.C. We have a role to play. And I've always held that jobs aren't created by politicians or elected officials, and as a former mayor, I'm sure I was guilty of talking about creating jobs. Jobs are created when individuals are willing to put capital at risk, their time and their talent, and we as public actors have to help create those conditions on the ground. And one of those critical conditions are, what are the resources to help people become skilled? Those who are underskilled get the relevant skills. Those perhaps in mid-career, and those skills have become less relevant. How do we make sure that those individuals are able to tap into those resources? So that's why this public-private partnership is so exceptionally important, and to have the industry-led stakeholders with the local stakeholders. Those were the goals of EDA and the Department of Commerce as we put this together, and it really wouldn't have happened without the leadership of Secretary Pritzker, who, it's been said time and time again, but it is worth repeating, for the first time in the history of the Department of Commerce has elevated workforce skills as a priority. Working very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Labor and the Employment and Training Administration, EDA is now, because of the relationship that Commerce has with the employers, is having this be a priority. And then for the second part of your question, it fits neatly within the Economic Development Administration's goals, because for 51 years now we have been working with communities across the country, large and small, urban and rural, to help create better economic conditions on the ground. And I really appreciate the perspective of Joe Mckinney. NATO is one of our closest partners, along with those stakeholders and those economic development districts where the work is really being done. We make investments, we provide seed capital and help them with training and technical assistance, but it's the day-to-day work that those men and women are doing. And EDA is uniquely positioned because we are the only federal agency whose focus is solely economic development. Every federal agency has some component of economic development, but only EDA is mission day in and day out of doing economic development. And having 50 plus years of experience, we've seen the evolution of economic development. We've seen the modernization of economic development, and the men and women who are within EDA, and I am just so thrilled that 2/3 of our staff are out in our 6 regional offices. So they're on the ground with those stakeholders working day to day. So that's why it fits very squarely within our mission, and we are seeking to institutionalize this such that the career staff who will be carrying this forward. The initiative started under this administration, but it's good government policy, and the career staff have really bought into this, not because they just thought, okay, well, this is what the leadership says. They've bought into this because they've seen the importance of making sure that this becomes part and parcel of incorporating into our CEDS, our comprehensive economic development strategies, making sure that as we have our investment priorities at the Economic Development Administration, that those investment priorities speak to workforce development as a critical component of how and when and where we make our investments. So we're excited that this is an initiative that we are seeing success in. We're excited to be just a small but I think relevant and impactful part of this agenda, and you'll hear from the communities, and I've heard it, I'll conclude with this, that nothing is more gratifying and more inspiring than being able to travel across the country and hear how this agenda is really taking root. And again, I just recall a few months ago the discussions that we had in Texas with what you all are doing and how dynamic it is, and I'm sure that each of the panelists will speak to that. But EDA, this is squarely within our mission, our focus, our priorities, and it's really something that I'm excited about, that as we begin to wind down this administration, we've helped position EDA to be more relevant, more impactful, specifically as it relates to workforce development skills as now a priority within the Economic Development Administration.
Great, thank you so much. And Adam, I'm coming to you next, and actually you don't have to travel very far to get to where Adam works. You're in Prince George's County, the Department of Environment, and you're administering this sort of large investment in the stormwater abatement infrastructure, and infrastructure is a hot topic these days. But before everybody was talking about infrastructure jobs, you all were looking at the infrastructure jobs that could be created out of this investment. So tell us about sort of the thought process you and your partners went through, and how you were approaching it, and also thinking about the folks in Prince George's County who really needed an opportunity for a better job, and what you were going to do to make that happen.
Sure, thanks, Maureen. I want to wish everybody good afternoon. It's great to be here. Just a little background, Prince George's County is a big county to the east here, and we are in the heart of the Chesapeake region. And Maryland and a lot of the Chesapeake Bay counties have made a priority to enforce the Clean Water Act, to take care of, in particular, stormwater pollution runoff. So Prince George's saw this as an opportunity to really create jobs and economic development. One of our biggest challenges in Prince George's is that a lot of our daytime population leaves the county to work in Montgomery, Washington, D.C., or Northern Virginia. But we saw that with the investments that we have to make in stormwater runoff, we can create business development right here in Prince George's County and provide opportunities for our residents. Now, the scale of this investment is pretty huge. To meet our requirements under the Clean Water Act and under state legislation, we have to spend about $1 billion in the next 10 years. And our county is not unique in doing this. There's going to be about $10 billion in what I call the restoration economy to make sure that our water is clean in the Chesapeake Bay region in that time period. So we try to be proactive, Maureen, in making sure that this investment and these policy choices really benefit the businesses and the local people in the county. So there's a few things that we did. The first is that we recognize that government has a key role in administering policy and economic development, but we don't have the only role. The government has strengths and we have weaknesses as well. One of our strengths is that we can tax people. we can collect fees, and that's important because there's a lot of power and influence, of course, economically in
Nice
doing
to hear that as a strength.
At the end of the day, it's a strength, but it's a subject of some debate, as we all know. But also, government has the authority to carry out the laws. That's a great strength. One of our weaknesses, and this may not be a surprise to folks in the audience, is that government is generally pretty slow. And we tend to be slow in construction projects in particular. So our approach was to partner with the private sector on this restoration with a private partner that would administer the overall construction projects. So we would provide guidance and the private sector would provide the actual administration of construction projects because they do that very quickly and they can maximize economies of scale. So by doing that, we're able to get money out on the street faster. As I mentioned, about $1 billion. We're ramping up now. We'll spend about 25 to 30 million just this year. And the next year, we're going to ramp up even more. In about 3 years, we're going to be spending about $60 million a year in Prince George's County. But by getting it through the private sector, they're able to get that money out on the street and make decisions about their subcontracting family and bringing folks on to make sure that money gets out to them faster. But we have choices. So we have choices about who gets these contracts and where are these projects located, and then who benefits from the employment choices that they make. So we structured in our contract, our public-private partnership, a goal of 50% local participation in our contracting. So local firms are getting the jobs. We're exceeding that now, and as I was sitting in my chair, I checked our metrics because we have them online. We're actually above 90% local contracting. And we've also asked those firms to build up to 50% local hiring, and we're on track to meet those goals. So that's one step, but still, as a government, we have choices. We don't, it's great that people are getting these jobs. It's great that this is a demand-driven restoration economy, but we want to really target, the government has a social mission, we want to target the chronically underemployed in our region. And that includes youth, that includes formerly incarcerated, veterans, and a handful of other classes. So again, we have some answers, we don't have others. So our approach now is to partner better to get to these local communities. So we have a coalition of about 20 nonprofits and other organizations that specialize in working with these folks. We've partnered with the Department of Corrections because they're with the inmates before they're returning inmates. We've partnered with a number of youth organizations, training organizations, and importantly, social service organizations that provide wraparound services. In general, there's a reason that a lot of these populations are chronically underemployed. It's not just a skills issue, but it's a multifaceted issue. So we're trying to address those in a comprehensive way, in addition to workforce training and WIA and the community college. So far so good. I know I'm well over my time, but we're really pleased again to be part of this partnership. We're sharing our notes online on our website, and we're really pleased to be part of the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Liz, I'm coming to you next because you also were looking at, and a lot of communities are concerned about what are the issues for young people trying to get into work and to get to decent jobs, and you were certainly focused on this in Buffalo. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about sort of the Say Yes intern program that you all developed and how that's kind of meeting the needs in the Buffalo region.
Great, yes, thank you, Maureen, and thank you all for coming. I'm so excited to be part of this wonderful panel that we've been working with for the last 18 months, and it's great to see everyone again. The Say Yes internship program actually came out of a prototype of the Workforce Development Coalition that was formed a little over a year ago of public-private partners who want to work to make our workforce system make sense both for our employers and also to really include everyone in our community. So as we were beginning our work together, our trust building, coalition building, the Communities at Work partnership team actually said to us one of the things we needed to think about was an early win opportunity and where can we build that trust through some wins to show that we can work together, we can see some progress. And we looked at what our opportunities were and really saw paid internships for college students as an opportunity that we could be successful in quickly and really scale up. So we partnered with Say Yes Buffalo, which is an organization, a collective impact organization that does K through 12 wraparound supports and also tuition assistance, and actually it's a full scholarship for all of our Buffalo Public School students. So when it was first announced, it was this big, all Buffalo Public School students will get to go to college for free, 2-year, 4-year post-secondary certificate, but really the meat of it is the wraparound supports that they're providing in the K through 12 system, from legal clinics, healthcare clinics, additional family support specialists that are working with students to reduce any barriers, financial, health, social, or academic, to post-secondary attainment. When we met with Say Yes, they said, we've definitely seen an increase in college matriculation, but we want to make sure that those students both are graduating and also are seeing a job for themselves in the region. So we thought that internships would be a great way for us to do that, be able to see what jobs are out there, explore different careers, well being paid, and really exploring the region. Our business community came together really for a few reasons. First, because we made this an employer-led initiative. Our coalition asked the employers to sit with us and say, why do you have an internship program? Why don't you have an internship program? What barriers do you have to building one? And how can we help you bring those down? And what is an internship program? We then worked with the college and career centers as well as Say Yes for outreach to the students to our postings. But we made sure that it was business-led, so while the career centers may have wanted us to do certain things because they felt that that was the best way to do something, we really wanted it to be led by industry and what they were seeing day to day. Some of our business community came to the table just out of good corporate citizenship. They already had an internship program, and this was a great opportunity for them to reach out to students who may not normally have access to interns. But a lot of our members and our participants are coming because they want to create a more inclusive and diverse workforce pipeline. So when we are looking 5, 10, but in some cases even 2 years down the road, you want to make sure that you're being accessible to everyone in the community, and that as Buffalo and the Niagara region is going through this renaissance that I think people are starting to talk about, and we're seeing some economic development in the region, that it's hitting all of our communities and all of its members. So we're really learning a lot over the last year from our employers who are telling us what we can do to improve the work for students. We didn't want this to just be connecting students to internships through a job posting board. We wanted to provide wraparound services. And when I say wrap services, I don't just mean transportation, childcare, and sort of your general social services, but also pre-training for the interns, so making sure that they were job ready when they got to their first day. Resume review with their colleges. We are working on right now some interview prep that will start earlier in the year based on our pilot year and what we think the students need. And then also services, high-touch services for our employers who maybe have never had an intern or haven't had an intern who isn't somebody's kid or neighbor, and how can you provide the best internship program for these students and make sure that they're really getting something out of it through internal mentoring and other programs. So we're excited to see it grow and scale up. We have some really big goals for the next 5 years, but we are really learning a lot from everyone here.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. And Peter, I'm going to come to you next, but before I do understand that the secretary has to be at another event soon, and I just did want to take one more chance to thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for coming and being here and supporting this work. We all really appreciate it. Great. Sorry to upstage you with that, Peter. And Peter, but you also had the advantage of having the secretary extol the work that you've been doing in Houston, and I know that you have a long history of thinking about how does economic development and workforce development come together, and maybe you could just, sort of add to what the secretary said and give us some more details about the work that you've been doing in Houston and how that's really been, an integral strategy for Houston in its approaches to employment development.
Yeah, so thank you. And once again, I want to thank the secretary and her team for really making this happen. And I will echo some of her comments, and certainly the Aspen Institute. Upskill Houston was created by the Greater Houston Partnership, which is the regional chamber and economic development organization serving the business community in Houston. And it was grounded in kind of global competitiveness and economic development, but also with a lens toward equitable development, so that the residents of the region share in the prosperity of the issue. And as we've heard, the assistant secretary and the secretary talk about, fundamentally, we were hearing from our employers and our members, we can't hire a qualified and skilled workforce. Otherwise, we're limiting our growth. So the partnership took on and created Upskill Houston, which is a 7-sector industry-led initiative, and I want to drill down on a couple points, and then we'll get to the questions. The first one, which the secretary mentioned, is we ground it strongly in employer leadership and responsibility. And this really takes the form of, one, sitting at tables where the employers already gather. So looking at trade associations like the Associated Builders and Contractors or the Associated General Contractors, or in the case of the petrochemical industry, the East Harris County Manufacturers Association, which all the plants belong to, where they're already talking about the issues and they have relationships so that they can actually lead from a position of strength and have a more collective voice. We also look at other places like the Texas Medical Center, which is where a lot of our hospitals are members, and how do we ground it there? And related to that is we also believe that because we're taking this on, we have to kind of walk the talk. So we did a recent build out for a new office for the partnership, and we subscribed to principles and worked with contractors and subs that were playing and focused on workforce development in the construction industry, because we felt like we couldn't be there without also playing in a different space to do that. The second piece really is around kind of ensuring that the employers are thinking about this as a supply chain problem. And how do we think about it in terms of getting the requirements defined well enough so that the suppliers, the educational institutions, the community-based organizations, the workforce board can align around those goals and efforts. So when we think about that, there are kind of 3 major pipelines that we've got to be working with, and the secretary talked about it, which is there's the youth that are coming into the workforce, and how do we work with school districts and community colleges? And when you're thinking about unemployed and underemployed adults and young adults, how are we working with the public workforce system and the community-based organizations, and how are we collectively working in a different space? And when you think about the incumbent talent, how do you work with the employers to ensure that they're increasing and thinking about the pathways that allow folks to progress within their careers and within their professions? And I want to add the punctuation point that the secretary talked about. We have an economy that is changing much more rapidly than it's ever changed from a technological perspective, and we've got to be building resiliency into our workforce to be able to adapt to that. When you think about driverless cars and what's going to happen to transportation, distribution, and logistics when you've got robots moving things around, and how are we thinking differently about that, and what are the technicians, the technologists, and the engineers we're going to need to support that kind of economy? So we're thinking about those talent pipelines, and how are we working with organizations like United Way of Greater Houston to actively coordinate and collectively get the nonprofit community that are serving these pipelines and to work together in a different way. We also work with the community colleges. So San Jacinto College was part of our team, but it was also kind of the representative of the 9 community college systems we have in the region, and how those systems are working together with the petrochemical industry to ensure that curriculum's better, that facilities are better, and that students have access to other things. So really thinking about this as a supply chain problem. And then really the third point really has been, as has been hinted, and you'll see in some of the reports, we prototyped ideas that help move us forward, move us into action. And one of the things we worked on with the construction industry was how do we develop a stronger entry-level pipeline? So we worked closely with the Public Workforce Board, United Way of Greater Houston, and the employers to actually think differently about how we brought folks into that piece of it. So those are kind of the three big things that we think about, and where we're going is we've got, other sectors to activate. How do we bring those learnings into this? And once again, how do we keep reinforcing that the employer leadership is essential to this, but how do we collectively continue to bring folks along and really think differently about that? So I'm going to keep it brief so we can get to some questions.
Yeah, great. And I'm going to be coming to you all for questions very quickly. And I'm just to give you a moment to think about them, I'm going to do a lightning round with the three of you. And it's going to be lightning this time. So I've been a nice moderator, but but now I'm going to be the demanding moderator. So just quickly, if you think about your experience with the communities that work partnership and the work that you've been doing, just maybe give one quick sort of key takeaway that you would say, here's the key takeaway for me that maybe another community would want to think about in doing this work. And Adam, I'm just going to start with you, and we'll go down the line, and then we'll be coming to you all, and folks have microphones, and so we'll be asking you to get a microphone if you want to ask a question. So.
Sure. Thanks, Maureen. I think the biggest takeaway I would share is humility. I think, the challenge that we all face on economic development and employment, so large and complex. I think we have to be humble about it and be open to finding the resources and expertise in our communities and outside of our communities to make things work.
Great, thank you.
I think for us, it was just that one organization can't solve this problem by themselves. We really went into this knowing that, I think, from the partnerships perspective, but getting the rest of our team on board with that it isn't just private sector's problem, it isn't just need to be solved by a government agency, and getting everyone to build their relationships and trust each other, and that it's not always what works for Houston and process that works there, while we use it as a best practice. We may not be able to do it exactly the same way based on the people and the things that are happening in our region and how we need to adjust accordingly.
Great, thank you.
I guess being a part of the network, one of the things that I took away from it, which isn't directly in our work, and it's hinted at in San Francisco and New York City, which is how do we deal with kind of essential parts of the economy that are not middle skills, which is what Upskill Houston is focused on. But how do we think differently about that part of an economy that's essential, that you need folks that are cleaning, hotel rooms and other things, and how are we bringing them into the system as well and thinking about the flow? And I think that was the big takeaway of the diversity of the folks in the room, was to have folks thinking from IT perspectives and industry sectors, but also from parts of an economy that others aren't really touching the same way. And I thought that was a big takeaway for me.
Great, thank you. Thank you, that was really terrific. Well done. Okay, and I think that there are some microphones, so we are ready to take questions from you all. If folks have questions that they want or comments that they want to share. So I see 1, 2, right there. So just right behind, right? Yep, there he is. And then I saw another hand over here. I'm going to take 3 questions, and then we'll come back up here. So the woman right here. Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrew Reamer, a public policy professor at George Washington University, and have many friends in the room. Steve, I worked with 25 years ago here when I was at Brookings, and I'm a member of the Secretary Pritzker's National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, as well as Secretary Perez's Workforce Information Advisory Council. So it's a question for Peter and a question for the Assistant Secretary. For Peter, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation has a talent pipeline management initiative in which Greater Houston Partnership, also a member of that group. So can you describe how these two initiatives from the U.S. Chamber-led and EDA complement each other? And Assistant Secretary, in your mind, this was an experiment, a demonstration. So what are the lessons learned for trying to move this forward into the next administration in a way that is useful?
Okay, I'm going to hold it for a sec and take a couple more questions, and then I'll come back to you all.
Well, this builds on your question. I'm Suzanne Immerman, a refugee from the Obama administration, U.S. Department of Education. I'm now consulting, so there's life after political appointments for anyone in the room. Just a quick question that builds on that, which is just from each of your perspectives, which are so important and unique in this work, can you give us your thoughts about what will be different under a new administration? Just reading the tea leaves, recognizing we don't know a lot yet, but I think that's on everyone's minds, and maybe you could share some thoughts with us.
And I thought I saw one more over here.
Yes, my name's Eddie Eiches, and I'm a union leader. And aside from the reference to Youngstown, which was, of course, middle-class jobs because of unions, there really wasn't one reference to unions. I know that one of the partnerships is with New York and with union-supported operations in the domestic arena. And I'm just curious whether, and there also was no reference to wages, a living wage. I mean, will these new jobs create living wages, and how important is that vis-a-vis EDA? And finally, there was really no reference to some kind of interagency type of, I know EDA is doing this incredible work, but you know, CDBG also does some kind of work, and of course back in the days of George W. Bush, they wanted to push community development block grants into EDA, which was stopped. But I'm curious as to working with different aid, you know, whether you have thought about the interagency stuff, and thank you.
Great. So I have a question specifically for Peter on the complementarity with the Chamber of Commerce effort, a question specifically for you on thoughts on the next administration, and then questions about what are the implications of this work for living wages, and also how it fits with other kinds of things like CDBG. So Peter, do you want to start? And then
Yeah, I'll start, which I think the Communities That Work partnership had much more of an economic development lens that really thinks about how does a region think competitively about kind of key aspects and drivers of that regional economy. And while that's an element of where the chamber is, the talent pipeline management work really, I think, gives some very helpful tools to anybody that's looking at this to really think about it fundamentally differently as a supply chain problem, in terms of how do you bring the tables together, how do you get competencies and credentials acknowledged, how do you, communicate those, how do you work with the training providers and really think about preferred providers over time, and then aligning incentives. And so I think there's an element to how that, kind of approach can be used and adapted. And so I think that's a helpful framework similar to the playbook that gives folks rich ingredients to take this forward. And I think one of the things we look at when we get to this question of living wage is what's the pathway the industry is helping to create? Because the reality is some entry-level positions aren't going to start at $20 an hour. It's going to start maybe at 15, but there's got to be a pathway from 15 within 3 or 4 years to get to $25, $30 a thing. So we have to look at it in some sense kind of time areas, but also really working with the industry to ensure that there's a pathway that they're articulating in a way that we're bringing folks into that deliberately, and not to put have a wall show up that prevents people from doing that.
Each of these questions were connected, and I think I can address them all, in a very brief period of time. With respect to this being an experiment, you are absolutely right. One of the lessons that I hope we take away is that government has to become less risk averse. This notion that this notion that we have found ourselves, encased in these bureaucratic silos because of statutes and regulations, and if we do something wrong, there's going to be a congressional inquiry. It's going to be on the front page of the Washington Post. I'm not talking about wild, risks that are just unmitigated disasters in the making, but this notion that we have to be willing to take smart risk, calculated risk, knowing that if we don't get it right, let's learn the lesson and figure out what we do next. I tell my team that, well, what we do is important. We're not working on a patient on an operating table, and if we screw it up, someone's going to die if we make the wrong incision or administer the wrong prescription. This is economic development. It's an art, it's a science, this is workforce development. So being able and willing to take those smart risks to learn the lessons and then to be able to replicate them. That's a lesson that I hope we can bring across more of these programs. Still being accountable, still being good stewards of the taxpayers' money, but willing to take some smart risks to be innovative. That also goes to the gentleman's issue with respect to the interagency. You're absolutely right. Having been a former director of community development, I understand how flexible and how valuable and powerful community development block grant funds can be. We are working, EDA has been tasked by the White House to lead the integration of federal economic development resources across multiple agencies. $17 billion, 80-some odd programs. There's been a long-standing criticism that the federal government had all these programs, all this economic development money, but was unable to gauge and measure the impact. EDA has been charged with helping to coordinate that so we can figure out how our Economic Development Administration funds, whether it's our Public Works funds or our Economic Adjustment Assistance funds, can work with CDBG, can work with USDA funds, can work with HUD, EPA or DOT funds. They don't always layer neatly, but to the extent that we can create a knowledge base and then train, educate, and deploy our staff working with other staffs, you'll find better integration. I mean, that is the only way we're going to be able to more effectively leverage these funds that, again, are to be catalytic to attract private investment. Public funds, government funds, federal funds in and of themselves are not going to be sufficient in any way, shape, or form. But they are able to go and mitigate risk, help create that patient capital that ultimately allows the private sector to come into it. And finally, I don't think any of us, or if there's anyone here who can predict what we can expect in a new administration, you're probably in the wrong line of work. You should be out there, predicting and making a whole lot of money. But what I will say is that one thing that was very clear in this election was the frustration of individuals who we are all working with who found themselves frustrated. And again, I just go to my Youngstown experiences. The days of steel mills dotting the Mahoning River are long gone. But there are still skills and still talents and abilities that exist in those regions and regions across the country. I use Youngstown, but I can equally use Pikeville, Kentucky, having spent a considerable amount of time there. How do we tap into that frustration, more than just in what we say, but the programs that we do that ultimately lead to skills that are relevant, impactful, that pay living wages? And again, it's not easy. It's not going to happen quickly. But we have demonstrated our ability in this country when we put our collective will and thought and effort and commitment to these things that we can indeed get it done.
Great, thank you. And I see that we're getting pretty close to time, so maybe I just want to start with Peter and come all the way down and just ask if you want to make one final remarks, and we'll finish with you, Jay.
Once again, I think the opportunity we have as regional economies is critically important to kind of get to this question of what's going to happen. When you look at some of the work Brookings and other folks have done, the resiliency of our regional economies and the leadership that can happen at a local level is critically important. And I think part of the election was kind of the local saying we need to work differently and expecting a better infrastructure from Washington, whoever was leading it. And so I think that's kind of what's coming.
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Peter said, I think really the regional partnerships and the things that we are doing on the ground are what's going to keep us moving no matter what happens, and having employer-led programs and prototypes and coalitions who are really telling us what they need so that we can make sure that we're training the workforce for the right jobs and careers in the region. So the people thinking Buffalo being, just now having people stay in the region and want to move to that area, making sure that they have the skills for the jobs that are available, and that we're not, again, just exporting students out into other areas. And we want people to be coming into our city, but then partnering with other states and cities and programs like this so that we can learn from each other and figure out what's working places, so that we're not all making the same mistakes, and we can help each other out and have sounding boards that maybe can see something differently than what you're seeing sort of when you're deep in it.
The last time it came around to me, I said one takeaway was humility. Another takeaway, which sounds contradictory but it's complementary, is confidence. I think that we can solve the challenges that we have. I think we can put more people to work. We can close the gap between jobs availability and people seeking for jobs. All this is not rocket science. It's something we can't do by ourselves, any one sector, any one entity. But coming together, there's enough resources, enough intellectual capital, enough creativity in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors that we can figure this out. So, you know, my big belief in public service is lean in. You know, together we can get a lot of great things done, notwithstanding, you know, how people are interpreting the results of the election. Government has a role, we all have a role, and, you know, we can come together and get a lot of positive things, and we've done so. But there's always a lot more to do.
Well, this is about communities that work, and this is about partnerships. And let me first take a moment just to acknowledge one of the bureaus that I'd mentioned earlier that Economic Development Administration is partnering with is the Employment and Training Administration at the Department of Labor. And the Assistant Secretary, Eric Sells, now is here, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Jerry Fiala, is also here. So I want to acknowledge the work that they have done and the partnerships that they have helped us put together. You know, in concluding, I want to congratulate all of you for participating, all of the communities, the successes that you all have, you know, accomplished, all of the participants who have sought to become more educated, more engaged in this very, very, very critical issue. One thing that is important to point out, and I say this in a completely apolitical session, context, but when we're talking about creating these jobs, when we're talking about making sure that we have the skills, understand that we have to talk about this in the context of a global economy. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about trade agreements and you know, and what those means and the implications. And again, I come from a community. I have seen, you know, the other side of the trade agreements that have, to a certain extent, helped to accelerate the hollowing out of communities that typically were manufacturing communities or the blue-class communities, blue-collar communities. But I've also seen the other side of that, that 95% of the world's population exists outside of this country. If we are going to talk about creating these living wage jobs that, you know, we get the relevant skills, we have to understand that that means that the employers who produce things, who provide services, have to be able to engage marketplaces outside of the country. This is still the greatest economy, the largest economy on the face of the planet. But understand that if 95% of the population exists outside of the U.S. borders, we have to make sure that these individuals are working in areas and working for companies and corporations that can sell and provide their goods and services, you know, outside of the U.S. in addition to the great market that we have here. So that's the other thing as we keep in mind all the, you know, training, economic development initiatives in the world, all the great training programs and great skills are going to be for naught or very much diminished if we, you know, don't have a perspective or a position that allows us to engage in, you know, we're not going to debate, you know, the terms of the, but it has to be fair, it has to be equitable, it has to make sense. But we have to make sure that we're understanding and talking about these things in a globalized marketplace. Whether John Smith or Sally Wilson ever sees themselves and what they're doing connected, understand that it is. Those markets need to be open. So, you know, it's been really an inspiring journey to be a part of this for the past number of years. Again, thank you to Aspen for all that you all have done, to all the partners that we have across. You know, while the administration comes to an end, by no means are we ending the commitment, you know, of this initiative. And that's why EDA, ETA, you know, NATO, NACO, U.S. Conference of Mayors, NLC, all of the partners that we've garnered, and most importantly, the communities, will continue to be involved in this. So, you know, again, thank you and congratulations for the success, and we look for, you know, an ongoing relationships and discussions as we move forward into a new administration.
Great, thank you all. Well, I want to thank particularly our three representatives from the communities. We had 7, as I mentioned, but I think, you know, I think this conversation really brought out some of what we've enjoyed so much about working with you, the humility, the trust, the focus on inclusion, the collaborative spirit, the openness to learning, the willingness to share, and the sense of urgency for really addressing some of the fundamental challenges we're facing right now. We really are grateful to you. I feel like I and my team learned a lot from you all, and I'm glad we had this opportunity to share with all of you this little bit, and thank you so much for being here. So please join me in thanking this panel.